I can speak only very briefly about the operations of the siege or blockade we were enduring. The fortifications of Genoa, at that time, consisted on the landward side of a simple wall flanked by towers, but what made the place highly defensible was that it was surrounded, at a short distance, by mountains whose summits and slopes were dotted with forts and redoubts. The Austrians constantly attacked these positions. As soon as they captured one, we marched to retake it, and the next day they tried again to seize it. If they succeeded, we would go and drive them out once more. In short, it was a continual shuttle with varied outcomes, but ultimately we ended up holding the ground. These battles were often very fierce. In one of them, General Soult, who was Masséna's right-hand man, was climbing at the head of his columns up Monte Corona to recapture the fort of the same name that we had lost the day before, when a bullet shattered his knee just as the enemy, vastly outnumbering us, came running down the mountain. It was impossible for the few troops we had at that point to resist such an avalanche. A retreat was necessary. The soldiers carried General Soult for a while on their rifles, but the unbearable pain he suffered led him to order that he be laid at the foot of a tree, where his brother and one of his aides-de-camp remained alone with him to protect him from the fury of the first enemy troops to arrive. Fortunately, there were among them some officers who treated their illustrious prisoner with great respect. The capture of General Soult emboldened the Austrians, and they pushed us hard up to the city wall, preparing to attack it, when a dreadful storm darkened the blue sky that we had enjoyed since the beginning of the siege. The rain fell in torrents. The Austrians halted, and most of them sought shelter in huts or under trees. Then General Masséna, whose chief talent was to make use of all the unforeseen circumstances of war, addressed his soldiers, rekindled their spirit, and, having them supported by some troops from the city, he had them lower their bayonets and led them, at the height of the storm, against the Austrians, who until then had been victorious. Surprised by such audacity, they withdrew in disorder. Masséna pursued them so vigorously that he managed to cut off a corps of 3,000 grenadiers, who laid down their arms. It was not the first time we had captured large numbers of prisoners, for the total taken since the beginning of the siege amounted to more than 8,000. But having no means to feed them, the commander-in-chief had always released them, on the condition that they would not serve against us for 6 months. The officers had faithfully kept their word. As for the unfortunate soldiers, who, once back in the Austrian camp, were unaware of the promise their commanders had made on their behalf, they were incorporated into other regiments and forced to fight the French again. If they fell into our hands once more, which happened often, we returned them again. They were again incorporated into other battalions, and many of these men, by their own admission, were captured 4 or 5 times during the siege. General Masséna, outraged by such bad faith from the Austrian generals, decided that this time the 3,000 grenadiers he had just taken would be held, officers and soldiers alike, and to avoid increasing the burden on the troops, he had these unfortunate prisoners placed on raised ships in the middle of the harbor and aimed a number of cannons from the pier at them. He then sent a messenger to General Ott, who commanded the Austrian corps outside Genoa, to reproach him for his lack of honor and to inform him that he would give the prisoners only half the ration received by a French soldier. However, he agreed that the Austrians could arrange with the English for boats to bring food daily to the prisoners and not leave until they had seen them eat it, so that no one would think Masséna was using this as a pretext to bring supplies to his own troops. General Ott, hoping that a refusal would lead Masséna to return his 3,000 men, whom he probably expected to use again against us, rejected the humanitarian proposal. So Masséna followed through on what he had announced. The French ration consisted of a quarter-pound of terrible bread and an equal amount of horse meat, so the prisoners received only half of each. They had therefore just a quarter-pound per day as their total food. This occurred 15 days before the end of the siege. These poor wretches remained under this regime the entire time. In vain, every 2 or 3 days, General Masséna renewed his offer to the enemy general, who never accepted, either out of stubbornness or because Admiral Lord Keith would not allow his boats to be used, fearing, it was said, that they would bring typhus aboard the fleet. Whatever the reason, the unfortunate Austrians howled with rage and hunger on the hulks. It was truly appalling. Eventually, after eating their boots, knapsacks, cartridge boxes, and perhaps even a few corpses, almost all died of starvation. Barely 700 to 800 were left when, the city having been handed over to our enemies, Austrian soldiers entering Genoa rushed to the port and gave food to their countrymen with so little care that all those who had survived up to then died. I wanted to recount this horrible episode, first as another example of the calamities that war brings in its wake, and especially to denounce the conduct and dishonesty of the Austrian general who forced his unfortunate soldiers, captured and released on parole, to take up arms against us again, even though he had promised to send them back to Germany. In the various battles that marked the siege of Genoa, I faced great dangers. I will mention only the two most significant. I have already said that the Austrians and the English took turns keeping us constantly under arms. Indeed, the former attacked us from land at dawn, fought us all day, and went to rest at night, while Lord Keith's fleet came to bombard us and tried to seize the port under cover of darkness. This forced the garrison to remain on high alert and prevented them from getting any rest. Now, one night, when the bombardment was even more intense than usual, General Masséna informed that, by the light of Bengal fires lit on the shore, many English boats full of troops were seen advancing toward the piers of the port, mounted his horse immediately with all his staff and the squadron of guides that always accompanied him. There were at least 150 to 200 horsemen. When we passed through a small square called Campetto, the general stopped to speak with an officer returning from the port. As everyone crowded around him, a shout rang out, "Watch out for the bomb!" All eyes turned upward, and we saw an enormous red-hot iron shell about to fall on this cluster of men and horses, packed into a very small space. I was next to the wall of the Grand Hotel, whose doorway was topped by a marble balcony. I pushed my horse underneath it, and several others did the same, but the bomb fell precisely on the balcony. It shattered it, then bounced onto the pavement and exploded with a terrible noise in the middle of the square, briefly illuminating it with its grim flames, followed by the deepest darkness. Everyone expected terrible losses. The deepest silence fell. It was broken by the voice of General Masséna, asking if anyone was wounded. No one replied, for by a truly miraculous chance, not one of the bomb's many fragments struck the men or horses packed into the little square. As for those, like me, who were under the balcony, we were covered in dust, fragments of paving stones, and bits of columns, but none of us were wounded. I said that the English usually only bombarded us at night. However, one day, as they celebrated some unknown holiday, their fleet, decorated with flags, approached the city at midday and amused themselves by firing many projectiles at us. The battery best positioned to return fire was near the pier, on a large bastion shaped like a tower called the Lantern. The commander-in-chief ordered me to instruct the battery commander to fire only after careful aiming and to concentrate all his fire on an English brig that had insolently anchored near the Lantern. Our gunners fired with such precision that one of our 500-pound bombs struck the English brig, piercing it from deck to keel, and it sank in an instant. This so infuriated the English admiral that he immediately moved all his bomb vessels against the Lantern and opened a very violent bombardment. My mission accomplished, I should have returned to Masséna. But it is rightly said that young soldiers, unaware of danger, face it more coolly than seasoned warriors. The scene before me was fascinating. The platform of the Lantern, paved with stone slabs, was about the size of an average courtyard and armed with 12 large cannons, mounted on enormous carriages. Although it is very difficult for a ship at sea to aim bombs accurately at a small area like a tower's platform, the English managed to land several on the Lantern. When they arrived, the gunners took cover behind and beneath the large wooden gun carriages. I did the same, but this shelter was not safe, because the platform resisted the bombs, which could not penetrate, and instead rolled rapidly over the stones, making it impossible to predict their path. Their fragments passed under and behind the carriages, ricocheting across the platform. It was foolish to remain there, when, like me, one had no duty to, but I felt a terrible thrill, if I may put it that way, running back and forth with the gunners whenever a bomb fell, and returning with them as soon as it exploded and its fragments stopped moving. It was a game that could have cost me dearly. One gunner had his legs shattered, other soldiers were severely wounded, for the fragments, huge pieces of iron, did dreadful damage to whatever they struck. One even cut in two a large carriage beam I was about to shelter behind. Yet I stayed on the platform until Colonel Mouton, who later became Marshal Count of Lobau, and who had served under my father and took an interest in me, saw me while passing near the lantern. He came and sternly ordered me to leave and go to the commander-in-chief's side, where I belonged. He added, "You are still very young, but learn that in war it is foolish to expose yourself to unnecessary danger. What would you gain if you got a leg smashed, without any benefit to your country?" I have never forgotten that lesson, for which I later thanked Marshal Lobau, and I have often thought of how different my fate would have been if I had lost a leg at 17. The courageous tenacity with which Masséna had defended the city of Genoa was about to yield immense results. Squadron leader Franceschi, sent by Masséna to the first consul, had managed, both going and returning, to pass at night through the enemy fleet. He returned to Genoa on the 6th of Prairial, saying that he had left Bonaparte descending the great St. Bernard at the head of the reserve army. Field Marshal Melas was so convinced of the impossibility of leading an army across the Alps that, while part of his troops, under General Ott, were blockading us, he had set off with the rest to attack General Suchet on the Var, 50 leagues away, intending to penetrate into Provence, thus giving the first consul the opportunity to enter Italy unopposed. The reserve army had therefore entered Milan before the Austrians had ceased to dismiss its existence as a fantasy. The resistance at Genoa had thus served as a powerful diversion in favor of France. Once in Italy, the first consul would have liked to come as soon as possible to the aid of the brave garrison of that place, but for this he had to assemble all his troops, as well as the artillery parks and war supplies, whose passage through the Alpine passes posed great difficulties. This delay gave Marshal Melas time to rush from Nice with his main forces to oppose the first consul, who from that point on could not continue his advance on Genoa until he had defeated the Austrian army. But while Bonaparte and Melas were making marches and countermarches in Piedmont and Milan to prepare for the battle that would decide the fate of Italy and France, the garrison of Genoa was reduced to the direst straits. Typhus was wreaking terrible havoc. The hospitals had become dreadful charnel houses. Misery was at its height. Almost all the horses had been eaten, and although many troops had long been receiving only half a pound of very poor food, the next day's distribution was not assured. Absolutely nothing remained when, on the 15th of Prairial, the commander-in-chief gathered all the generals and colonels at his quarters to inform them that he was determined to attempt a breakthrough with what men remained fit for duty in order to reach Livorno. But all the officers unanimously declared that the troops were no longer capable of sustaining combat, or even a simple march, unless they were first given enough food to regain their strength, and the stores were absolutely empty. General Masséna, then considering that, after having executed the first consul's orders by entering Italy, it was his duty to save the remnants of a garrison that had fought so valiantly and which the nation had an interest in preserving, finally resolved to negotiate the evacuation of the city, for he did not want the word capitulation to be uttered. For more than a month, the English admiral and General Ott had proposed a meeting to General Masséna, which he had always refused. But finally, overpowered by circumstances, he sent word to these officers that he accepted. The conference took place in a small chapel located in the middle of the Conegliano Bridge, which, by its position, was situated between the French posts and those of the Austrians. The French, Austrian, and English staffs occupied the two ends of the bridge. I attended this highly interesting scene. The foreign generals showed Masséna particular marks of deference, esteem, and consideration, and although he imposed conditions unfavorable to them, Admiral Keith kept repeating, "General, your defense is too heroic for us to refuse you anything." It was therefore agreed that the garrison would not be taken prisoner, that it would keep its weapons, would go to Nice, and could, the day after arriving in that city, resume hostilities. General Masséna, understanding how important it was that the first consul not be led to make some compromising move, driven by his strong desire to come to Genoa's aid, requested that the treaty allow passage through the Austrian army for 2 officers whom he intended to send to the first consul, to inform him of the evacuation of the city by the French troops. General Ott opposed this because he planned to depart soon with 25,000 men from the blockade corps to join Field Marshal Melas, and did not want the French officers sent by General Masséna to inform the first consul of his march. But Admiral Keith resolved this issue. They were about to sign the treaty when several cannon shots were heard in the distance, amid the mountains. Masséna set down his pen, exclaiming, "There is the first consul arriving with his army." The foreign generals were stunned, but after a long wait, it was determined that the noise came from thunder, and Masséna agreed to conclude the treaty. The regret was not only over the loss of additional glory that the garrison and its leader would have gained if they had held Genoa until the arrival of the first consul. Masséna also wished, by resisting a few more days, to delay the departure of General Ott's corps. He foresaw that the general was going to join Field Marshal Melas, to whom he would be a great asset for the battle that was about to take place with the first consul. This fear, though well-founded, did not materialize, as General Ott was only able to join the main Austrian army the day after the Battle of Marengo, the outcome of which would have been very different for us had the Austrians, whom we had such difficulty defeating, had 25,000 more men to oppose us. Thus, not only did the powerful diversion Masséna achieved by defending Genoa open the passage of the Alps and deliver Milan to Bonaparte, but it also removed 25,000 enemies from the field on the day of the Battle of Marengo. The Austrians took possession of the city of Genoa on the 16th of Prairial, after a full 2-month siege. Our commander-in-chief attached such importance to ensuring that the first consul was informed in good time of the treaty he had just concluded, that he requested a safe conduct for 2 aides-de-camp, so that if one of the 2 fell ill, the other could carry the dispatch. And since it could be useful for the officer entrusted with this mission to speak Italian, General Masséna entrusted it to Commander Graziani, a Piedmontese or Roman in French service. But our commander-in-chief, the most suspicious of all men, fearing that a foreigner might be swayed by the Austrians and not act with all possible diligence, appointed me to accompany him, giving me particular instructions to hasten the march until we had reached the first consul. This recommendation was unnecessary. Mr. Graziani was a man of good character who understood the importance of his mission. We departed from Genoa on the 16th of Prairial, where I left Colindo, whom I planned to retrieve within a few days, since the first consul's army was known to be nearby. Mr. Graziani and I joined him the next evening in Milan. General Bonaparte spoke to me with interest about the loss I had just suffered, and promised to act as a father to me if I behaved well, and he kept his word. He could not stop questioning Mr. Graziani and me about what had occurred in Genoa, as well as the strength and movements of the Austrian corps we had passed through to reach Milan. He kept us by his side and had us loaned horses from his stables, as we had travelled on post mules. We followed the first consul to Montebello, and then to the battlefield of Marengo, where we were employed to carry his orders. I will not go into detail about this memorable battle, in which I came to no harm. It is known that we were on the verge of being defeated, and we probably would have been if Ott's 25,000 men had arrived on the field during the action. The first consul, who feared their appearance at any moment, was very worried and only regained his good spirits when our cavalry and the infantry of General Desai, whose death he was not yet aware of, secured the victory by breaking through the Austrian grenadier column led by General Zach. Noticing then that the horse I was riding had been slightly wounded in the thigh, the first consul pulled me by the ear and said jokingly, "I'll lend you my horses to have them treated like that." With Commander Graziani having died in 1812, I am the only French officer who attended both the siege of Genoa and the Battle of Marengo. After this memorable affair, I returned to Genoa, which the Austrians evacuated following the treaty concluded after our victory. There I found Colindo and Commander R.R. I visited my father's tomb, then we embarked on a French brig, which transported us to Nice in 24 hours. A few days later, a vessel from Livorno brought Colindo's mother, who had come to retrieve her son. This excellent young man and I had endured many hardships together, which had cemented our bond. But our paths were different, and we had to part, though with deep regret. I mentioned earlier that during the middle of the siege, aide-de-camp Franceschi, bearer of General Masséna's dispatches to the first consul, had managed to reach France by passing at night through the English fleet. It was through him that the death of my father was learned. My mother then convened a guardianship council, which sent orders to old Spire, who had remained in Nice with my father's carriage and equipment, to sell everything and return to Paris immediately, which he did. Nothing held me any longer on the banks of the Var, and I was eager to rejoin my dear mother. But this was not easy, as public transportation was scarce at the time. The coach from Nice to Lyon departed only every 2 days, and was booked for several weeks in advance by a crowd of wounded or sick officers coming like me from Genoa. To solve the difficulty this caused, Commander R.R., 2 colonels, about a dozen officers, and I decided to form a small caravan to walk to Grenoble, crossing the foothills of the Alps via Grasse, Sisteron, Digne, and Gap. Mules carried our small baggage, allowing us to travel 8 to 10 leagues a day. Bastide was with me and was of great help, as I was not used to walking such long distances, and it was extremely hot. After 8 days of very difficult marching, we reached Grenoble, where we found coaches to take us to Lyon. I revisited with sorrow the city and the hotel where I had stayed with my father in happier times. I longed for and dreaded reuniting with my mother and brothers. It seemed to me that they would demand to know what I had done with their husband and father. I was returning alone, and I had left him in a tomb on foreign soil. My grief was intense. I needed a friend who could understand and share it, while Commander R. and Pose, delighted after so many deprivations to have finally regained comfort and good food, was in a state of wild cheerfulness that broke my heart. So I resolved to leave for Paris without him. But he insisted, when I had no need of him, that it was his duty to return me to my mother's arms, and I was forced to endure his company all the way to Paris, where we travelled by mail coach. There are scenes that people of heart understand and that cannot be described. I will not attempt to depict the anguish of my first meeting with my grieving mother and my 2 brothers. You can imagine it. Adolphe was not in Paris. He was in Rennes with Bernadotte, commander-in-chief of the Western Army. My mother owned a rather lovely country house in Carrière, near the forest of Saint-Germain. I spent 2 months there with her, my uncle de Canrobert, who had returned from emigration, and an old knight of Malta, Mr. d'Estrées, a former friend of my father. My younger brothers and Mr. Gault joined us from time to time, and despite the kindness and affection they all showed me, I fell into a deep melancholy, and my health deteriorated. I had suffered so much, both morally and physically. I became incapable of any work. Reading, which I had always loved, became unbearable. I spent much of the day alone in the forest, lying under the shade, and lost in sorrowful reflection. In the evening, I would accompany my mother, my uncle, and the old knight on their usual walk along the banks of the Seine, but I took little part in their conversation and hid my sad thoughts, which always returned to my unfortunate father, dying for lack of care. Though my condition alarmed my mother, Canrobert, and Mr. d'Estrées, they wisely refrained from making remarks that would only irritate a troubled soul. Instead, they gently tried to distract me from the painful memories that tore at my heart by bringing forward the holidays of my 2 younger brothers who came to stay in the country. The presence of these 2 children, whom I loved dearly, was a welcome diversion from my sorrow, through the care I took to make their stay in Carrière pleasant. I took them to Versailles, Maison, and Marly, and their innocent joy gradually revived my soul, which had been so cruelly wounded by grief. Who would have told me then that these two beautiful, vibrant children would soon cease to exist? That concludes the 8th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.